So hi, I'm Nicky Rehnberg. Thank you so much for having me. I've wanted to be part of the Rachel Carson Center since I learned about it a decade ago. A former professor, now former professor of mine, was a former fellow, and I've just always wanted to be part of this community, and so it's really cool to actually be here and sharing my work with you. So I'm a doctoral candidate of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and today I'm going to talk to you about my dissertation, White Roots, Redwoods, Racializing German and U.S. Conservation, 1920 to 1945, and give you a little preview of it in action by presenting an abridged version of my first chapter. Before I miss the trees for the forest, let me introduce you to two of my favorite species, coast redwoods, Sequoia sempervirens, and giant sequoias, Sequoia dendron gigantea, have a history of being mistaken for each other, at least as long as California's colonialism, which is since about the 17th century. Coast redwoods and giant sequoias are not the same species. This is a huge pet peeve of mine. They are in the same family, cypress, and yes, they are big. And because settlers and colonizers are very creative, for nearly 2 centuries, and in some parks even still, both have been interchangeably called big trees. So let's get into some of their differences. They're both massive, figuratively and literally, with coast redwoods being the tallest species on Earth and giant sequoias the largest species by mass. Both can and will live over 3,000 years if left alone. They both endemically grow in what is now California, with coast redwoods following the shoreline between San Francisco and the top of the state, and giant sequoias only found within the Sierra Nevada mountains. Both have been threatened by colonialism and industrialization, but for different reasons. Early conservation efforts by the Sierra Club and later state and federal government protections blocked necessary forest fires in giant sequoia forests. This sounds great at first, until you realize that giant sequoias need fire in order to thrive. The fire kills small areas of the tree canopy and the overaccumulation of dead leaves in order for young saplings to survive. Fire also heats up the cones of mature trees, which makes it easier for the species to reproduce. So the health of giant sequoia forests actually declined in the first century or so of the species' conservation and preservation. Giant sequoias could not offer much as a natural resource besides their beauty and potential as a scientific source of knowledge. More on that later. This is because it is extremely difficult to fell a giant sequoia because of their girth, uneven surface, and the remote location in which they grow. Coast redwoods, on the other hand, were very easy to cut down because even though they were massive, they were less wide, have a consistently straight surface, and grew very close to both ocean ports and California gold rush sites in the mid-19th century, with logging being fully industrialized by 1863. Besides their location, coast redwoods also have consistently straight grains, are impervious to rot because of the tannin within them, and they were thought to be fireproof. I'm going to show you a quick clip. This really illustrates to me a lot of things about coast redwood use. Let me tell you about it while this is playing in the background. So here's a quick video showing the overutilization of coast redwoods in San Francisco, the nearest city to the coast redwood forest. Looking at this clip taken days before the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and its accompanying fire, we can see an urban coast redwood forest. The buildings, the recording equipment passes were primarily built out of coast redwood with coast redwood furniture and decor inside of them. The trolleys glided across coast redwood rail ties and had seats made of coast redwood. Under the ground were coast redwood pipes used for early plumbing. If we were to continue going up Market Street, which is what we are on now in San Francisco, we could see coast redwood boardwalks and piers with a port built upon coast redwood piling. The ferry building that you can see in the far distance is, you guessed it, made out of coast redwood. The city burnt down 3 days later after this was filmed, and San Franciscans basically went back into the forest for more timber and rebuilt the whole city again. And they ended up doing this 3 more times because of multiple fire events. So, you may be thinking that all I've told you sounds very Californian. I am very Californian, I understand. And perhaps you are wondering why and how Germany is going to enter this picture. So, it all began with an internship at Redwood National Park for the summer after my first year of the PhD, and I fell in love with the many facets of coast redwoods. My work required me to learn cultural and environmental preservation assessment, and I worked with botanists and foresters to learn about the ecosystems of coast redwoods. Fun fact, they have 3 ecosystems because their height provides different conditions for different flora and fauna to thrive. The top-holed shrimp that are deposited by marbled murrelets, an endangered species in California, and they are seabirds who love the higher portions of the canopy. So while interning, I also assisted architects' assessments of historical structures made out of coast redwood in the park, which you can see on my first day on the left. On the right, a few years later, my friend and I were able to return to the same barn with a nonprofit in the US called HistoriCorps and learn how to fix the problems we had previously assessed. Through all of my time in coast redwood and giant sequoia parks, especially in 2018, something that kept coming up was a connection to Germany in these spaces. No one could tell me what it was. Since I worked in the park archives during the day, I tried to find out after my shifts ended. There were no answers there. It became a side quest for me that continued after the summer, and I even began taking German language classes so I could try to find out more information. And as I started trying and failing and trying again to learn German, I was able to find, translate, and eventually read resources about Mehmet Bama. The first one that I found was Sequoia Farm Kaltenkirchen, started in 1945 by Isla and Ernst Martin after their community forest had been burnt to the ground in the final days of World War II. They loved trees, and they were dentists who became dendrochronologists, so tree ring studiers, finding solace in the slow, steady stability that studying trees provides. And I totally agree. That was why I wanted to study the trees, after all. And it wasn't just their status as charismatic megaflora, but something about the feelings they evoke, how they face the present and the future with a steadfast stoicism I'm sure many of us would like to embody one day. After communicating with the current caretaker of Sequoia Farm Kaltenkirchen, I came out to Germany last summer and was able to see the seed of my dissertation project. When I saw them, I kept shaking my head, because I had been trained in the national parks in the US to understand coast redwoods and giant sequoias could not grow anywhere besides their respective ecosystems. But there they were on the Dutch border of Germany, living their best lives. So I answered the German question for you, and you'll see it play out more as I talk about my dissertation. But I have another part of my title that is probably sticking out to you, and that is racializing conservation. This is a term I created to articulate something that I see in the past and the present. In my dissertation's case study, this is the entangling of environmental conservation and eugenics. Eugenics is scientific racism, applying evolutionary theory, I put in scare quotes, to trying to understand human germplasm and make the best humans. So conservationists and eugenicists in both Germany and the US worked together, even during 2 world wars, where they were fighting, famously, to make racial sciences appear natural to both nations' publics through public exhibits. They did this by reflecting eugenic values in the curation and interpretation of regional parks and natural history museums in both countries. Racialized conservation is an opportunity, I hope, through which we can admit that a Venn diagram considering the historical actors, institutions, and methodology of conservation and eugenics during the 1920s to the 1940s would basically be a circle. The racist sins of nature parks or even environmental science knowledge production did not end with settler colonialism, as some have suggested. And this is the kicking out of the indigenous and the poor, using federal authority to save lands, to create parks that really serve the recreation of the rich. These sins continue, though, in how some environmentalists consider what and how sites or natural resources should be conserved and preserved today. They continue in the inaccessibility of, quote, natural spaces for unlikely hikers and the marginalized who either cannot or will not visit nature because of its exclusivity. In the US especially, this can make nature spaces seem as though it is for a certain type of Theodore Rooseveltian rough-riding masculine type. But these sins also continue in misanthropic whisperings of population control for the sake of the planet. So, to bring all of this together, my dissertation, White Roots, Redwoods, traces the collaboration between conservation groups such as the US Save the Redwoods League and Sierra Club, and the German Bund Heimatschutz, League for Homeland Protections, and Ardennengesellschaft, Ardeman League, and their saving of coast redwoods and giant sequoias in both countries. With this, big trees became a symbol, method, and form of data to promulgate white supremacy. The collaboration between US and German transnational movements entangled racial and ecological management. Following this, German and US scientists and science popularizers then curated conservation and eugenic knowledge with the public through park and museum exhibits interpreting big trees through a eugenic lens. To save big trees was to save the white race. So, my methods. To write White Roots, Redwoods, I have visited archives in Germany and the US to examine collections related to the entangled history of German and US conservation, including, but not limited to, public media and professional journal publications from the time period, state and federal papers, institutional records, forestry records, personal writing and correspondence, and my favorite, the trees, groves, and parts of trees, so think crosscuts in museums and parks. To trace the process of communication and collaboration between German and US conservationists through this transnational eugenic knowledge community and creating big tree exhibits, each chapter of White Roots, Redwoods focuses on a specific institution that racialized conservation. These institutions so far will include the American Museum of Natural History, Prairie Creek Redwood State Park, Killesburg Park, which was built for the 1939 Reichsgartenschau in Stuttgart, the Natural History Museum of Berlin, and or the Botanical Garden of Bonn. I'm still translating material. And of course, the Sequoia Farm Kaldenkirchen, and all of this is between 1920 and 1945. Analyzing the different German and US big tree exhibits during this time period traces how public-facing scientific knowledge production in these institutions racialized conservation, a legacy that we frankly still live with today. In my introduction, getting to the environmental roots of white supremacy, I argue that conservation and eugenics movements shared historical roots, beginning in the 1870s in both Germany and the US, which has been obscured by the popularity of conservation's necessity for human survival and eugenics' connection to the Holocaust. Both movements shared the goals of understanding the limits of human control over the environment and the environment's control over humans. I will talk about chapter 1, Racializing Redwoods, today, and then briefly describe the chapters that follow. So, in this chapter, I analyze the use of big trees at the Second International Exhibition of Eugenics at the American Museum of Natural History as a symbol, method, and data to showcase and promote a eugenic agenda. I do this in 3 parts. I begin with an abbreviated history of trees as a symbol and method because these are the roots from which the eugenics tree, the image on this slide, grew. Genealogists and life scientists have long used trees as a symbol of life and connections changing over time, and they became a methodological tool to make sense of and order life as well. Eugenicists were no exception, as I show in my second section. Harry H. Laughlin and his assistant Alice M. Helmer continued this practice and created the eugenics tree image in 1919, 2 years before the exhibition. The image featured allied sciences at the root of the tree, which showed how different disciplines naturally came together to create eugenics. Laughlin, head of the Exhibitions Committee used the image and its organizing logic to create the exhibition's theme, Eugenics and Allied Sciences, and the organization of its 131 displays, which over 10,000 people visited over the course of a week. Besides as a symbol and method of organization, big trees were used as data, as I show in my final section of this chapter. One of the displays was made the symbol and method of trees real by presenting research using big trees as data that proved climatic changes over time were because of immigration, and that had led to civilizational decline. So my first section, like I said, looks at the history of trees as an image used to understand and communicate natural history for thousands of years. The oldest example is genealogy, with Confucius's family tree going back over 2,500 years, and this practice of tracing family histories and lineages, kinship, and pedigrees has continued since. And most of the time when we think of that work, we think of them as creating family trees. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species used the tree of life as a metaphor, model, and research tool to explore the evolution of life and the relationship between species, living and extinct. With his tree, which you can see on the left, life scientists began to understand shared descent, the idea that all species are related and ultimately evolved from a common ancestor. Further, Darwin himself could not help but use flowery prose to explain the survival of the fittest. Quote, "As buds give rise by growth to fresh buds, and these, if vigorous, branch out and overtop on all sides many a feebler branch." German biologist Ernst Haeckel's phylogenetic trees, which you can see on the right, work to make sense of literal forests. Haeckel's trees do not only track systemic change over time, but the relationships between different aspects within the system as well. Ecology continued its evolution, and trees were used to trace species and species relationships in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and a forest of phylogenetic trees grew. Trees as actual trees, not just as illustrations, but as living beings, began to rise in popularity as a symbol of science and scientific progress as well in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and they were primarily big trees. John Muir, and later the Sierra Club and the Save the Redwoods League, believed that if the public could see nature and learn its mechanisms while in it, they would be moved to save it. Being able to visualize what needed to be saved was one of the most important aims. While Muir and other writers hoped that visitors would come to see their sites, conservation groups also found success with including pictures and drawings of the big trees in their publications. The symbol of this work was naturally a big tree because they were what made up the swaths of land that the Sierra Club and Save the Redwoods were trying to save. The trees were remarkable and marketable for fundraising. Drink some water. Wait, what? Okay. Growing from the genealogy of scientific tree images, my chapter's second section historicizes the creation of the eugenics tree, which you can see on the right. It is a major symbol of eugenics still. So if you Google eugenics, at least in the US, it usually will be one of the first 4 images that pops up. While it is relatively ubiquitous in the 20th century's history of science, its origins were unknown. Its roots began in 1919 when Harry H. Laughlin, director of the US Eugenics Record Office at the time, tried to articulate how eugenics was so much more than a singular scientific discipline. It was the culmination of scientific disciplines. He worked with his assistant, Alice M. Helmer, to draft an image to make sense of the connections he found between eugenics and other disciplines, showing eugenics as the robust science that Laughlin understood it to be. They needed a form that showed complexity and change over time. A tree was a natural fit. Much like previous tree models of ordering natural historical knowledge, the eugenics tree organizes information, both showing how they understood disciplines changing over time, while also showing how different sciences fit together, either through their branching off or proximity. Genetics, for example, is the major route that branches out to psychology and biology, which branches to anatomy and physiology. Medicine, surgery, and psychiatry, on the other side of the tree, branch out from their own unnamed branch next to sociology. The efforts of the eugenics tree culminated in the article, The Relation of Eugenics to Other Sciences. The image was not included in the article, but I was able to piece together the history through Laughlin's footnotes in another essay published in another journal in 1923, citing Helmer as the image's artist. This actually makes sense, as I found that she was also an illustrator of some early Drosophila, so famous fly genetics work, so it was very cool. The image was powerful to the eugenics movement because it showed that much of human intellectual endeavors were the roots of eugenics. Through this, Laughlin attempted to show that eugenics had a long history tied to an even longer list of disciplines, which he described as allied to eugenics. Because of its power, when Laughlin was appointed head of the exhibition committee for the Second International Exhibition of Eugenics, he organized it like the eugenics tree. Most of the halls collected 18 alcoves, which represented a specific root of eugenics, pictured here on the left. Disciplines included genetics, breeding of domestic animals, human heredity, genealogy, sociology, though referred to as human migration and immigration, psychiatry, population and vital statistics, and geography. In the exhibition book Laughlin published in 1923, he continued the floral phrasing, describing the event as a, quote, cross-section view of eugenical science at the time of the Second Congress. By using the different roots of eugenics, presenters showed how many intellectual endeavors worked towards eugenic aims. The most deliberate use of big trees at the Second International Exhibition of Eugenics, however, was a display by Yale geography professor Ellsworth Huntington, part of the Huntington family, distinctly related to railroad money. He was descended from Plymouth puritanical stock. In 1921, he was in his fourth year as the president of the Ecological Society of America and working on the second edition of his book, Civilization and Climate, which inspired his display at the exhibition. My main access to Huntington's display is through Laughlin's aforementioned exhibition book, finding it explicitly on the exhibition map, which you can see on the left. Since it was so neatly and clearly labeled on the map, I knew that it was from the still intact American Museum of Natural History's cross-section of a giant sequoia, which you can see a bad version of in the middle that I took in 2021. So the display was at the exit and entrance of the exhibit, which a long view of the exhibit you can see on the left. My main access to Huntington's display is through Laughlin's aforementioned exhibition book. Oh, nope, wait, I read that. I was able to understand how the half-page list of short descriptions of Huntington's 10 maps and 3 charts worked together through reading his correspondence, planning the exhibit, and also his writings of the time. His display was on the American Museum of Natural History's Big Tree cross-section because Huntington used big tree rings to support his hypothesis that recent non-white migration had changed the climate and was ruining, quote, civilization. Huntington's exhibit stemmed from a specific part of his work in the 1910s, in which he published a report with the U.S. Department of the Interior called The Secret of the Big Trees, which you can see on the left. He used the trees as an archive, reading them against the grain, literally, to study climate patterns not just of the area of the individual tree, but to compare and hypothesize upon the history of the global climate. There were several reasons why big trees were used. As Huntington explained in his report, they were the best to use because of their distinct age of nearly 3,000 years and clear ring patterns that allowed him to compare climatic changes that he traced prior in Turkey and his travels all around the world. He talks about his field work, which you can see in the 2 images on the right. Giant sequoias were deeply entangled in his methodology for portion of his book, Climate and Civilization, which becomes clear in the book's first few sentences. The races of the earth are like trees. As russet apples and pippins may grow from the same trunk, and as peaches may even be grafted from a plum tree, so the culture of allied races may be transferred to one another. And then he continued with an extended metaphor that kind of made sense, but not really, for nearly 3 pages, in which he argued that culture is like a fruit's flavor, depending on racial inheritance that can only be changed by the slow processes of biological variation and selection. In Huntington's estimation, this was because people, like trees, relied on limited resources in order to grow. By studying the climate, Huntington sought to provide an ecological understanding to eugenics, and he later became the president of the American Eugenics Society as well. He believed that highly variable weather patterns contributed to the development of advanced civilization because it motivated the individual to work while the weather was good, because it would soon change. This created climatic efficiency, as humans were prodded along by the climate to become methodically energy-saving, a mark of progress in his estimation, and what Huntington was most interested in, civilization. He traced these climatic changes in his displays 3 charts. Huntington's display on the big trees really, in my view, gets to the heartwood, which is a tree's supporting pillar of eugenics and conservation thinking in the early 20th century. Huntington's research studied the relationships between landscapes and humans in order to better serve and control both in mass. Saving trees through conservation was saving people, in Huntington's opinion. Drastic climatic shifts, particularly toward the increase of heat and decrease in variation, negatively impacted humans in their daily lives and their endeavors toward progress, whatever that is. Huntington is now most known for his work conceptualizing environmental determinism, a usually racist belief that the physical environment predisposes communities towards different developmental paths. His status as a geographer, his study of the climate, his use of tree rings could all seem innocuous and divorced from the bigger eugenics exhibition with its alcoves that outlined the races of man and pedigrees of dysgenic or cocogenic families. The opposite of eugenic would be those things. Huntington's exhibit marked the clearest connection between conservation and eugenics, and this just became clearer through the following decades. Controlling landscapes and human bodies were the aims of both movements. Huntington's exhibit shows how eugenics and conservation use the same methods to accomplish this. So now I will tell you quickly about the rest of my dissertation. Chapter 2, Nativist Parks, analyzes the entangled creation of the Save the Redwoods League, Coast Redwood State Parks, and the California State Park System through its eugenic lens. You can see some of the early infrastructural developments that make parks possible. On the right, League founders Madison Grant, who wrote the Racist Screed, The Passing of the Great Race, which you can see in the bottom left, which was also known as Hitler's Bible and part of the Nuremberg trials. As evidence, he and his colleague, Harry Fairfield Osborne, wanted to preserve, quote, noble and native coast redwoods of Humboldt County. The work to create the first few parks are filled with massive bureaucratic mismanagement, and what I am pretty sure I am finding is tax fraud. I call these early coast redwood preserving parks, namely Redwood State Park and Prairie Creek Redwood State Park, nativist parks, because they supported and were supported by finances and public representation of the native species movement and the anti-immigration nativist movement. Through park funding, construction, and interpretation, saving coast redwoods was again equated with saving whiteness. The trees and their destruction was symbolic of the dissolution of whiteness and masculinity through industrialization and immigration that only these public parks could fix. This is a legacy that the parks are still working through, which you can see in a very recent interpretive sign found in these parks on the top left. Chapter 3 is unnamed, and I will investigate exhibits featuring the curation and interpretation of big trees either at the Museum of Natural History in Berlin or the Botanical Garden in Bonn that were held in the 1920s and 1930s. I've not been able to visit archival material on them just yet, but there were almost displays of big trees at these institutions. Save the Redwoods League and Sierra Club members were in conversation with members of the National Socialist Blutenboden movement, which expressed racial ideology and romantic nationalism, wanting Germans to work on German soil, who wanted to curate and interpret displays of big trees at these institutions. Chapter 4 is what I'm starting to work on right now, which is called Blood and Soil in the Garden, and it examines another park that, quote, perfected nature for the public, the German Reichsgartenschau of 1939. Blutenboden leader Richard Walther there worked with other National Socialist representatives to display, quote, German gardens, but these included Californian big trees, and it also had Jewish prisoners preparing the land to become a garden. Both of these things are wildly antithetical to Blutenboden's call for Germans to plant German flora on German land. And finally, in my conclusion, growing a new kind of eugenics, I consider that after World War II, conservation and eugenics continued to work together, but in a new way. Local tree enthusiasts planted big trees in their forest after it was bombed near the end of World War II, and they created Sequoia Farm Kaldenkirchen. This site has since collaborated with transnational geneticists since the 1940s to study how its groves have been able to sustain big trees that thrive in very different climates. This is the beginning of my next project that will trace the transnational research on big trees' genetics to grow them quickly and globally for their utility as carbon sinks. To explain my project stakes, I offer you a memory. When I was pretty young, I remember working in the garden we had in the back of the house I grew up in, and my mom always dragged me out to help. One day we were digging out saplings, which seemed to be pretty contrary to our normal goal of putting plants into the soil. And when I asked her why we were doing this, she told me that they had white root rot. Will they die? I asked. And my mom assured me that if we took care of the problem, if we removed the diseased areas and gave extra love and care to the plant and the soil around it, they would be stronger and better than ever. This quiet moment with my mom, now also planted in the ground, is the title and basis of my dissertation and what I hope to accomplish. To work towards environmental justice and planetary survival, which are the same project, is to understand the roots of white supremacy in environmental management and to actively work towards taking out its sick roots one by one and providing love and care to the areas that surround it. So to wrap up, let's be friends. I am here for nearly 5 more months. Here are some of the things I would love to talk to you about. Race, class, gender, and the environment, transnational parks, trees, especially big ones, local, regional, national, and trans or international collaborative land management, infrastructure and institutions, particularly ones that make nature, whatever that is, accessible, whatever that is, and finally, and unfortunately, white supremacy and the environment. And absolutely finally, I would be remiss not to wish you a great Star Wars Day, May the 4th, and say, may the forest be with you. Here you can see some Ewoks from Return of the Jedi, which was filmed in Prairie Creek Redwood State Park. Thank you.